Hey everybody! In today's video we are going to talk about all things ick and ick related. I got some questions last night in my live stream about cold water ick, which I had never heard of, and also stress ick was mentioned, and I'd never heard of that either. Now, stress ick, kind of self-descriptive there. It is apparently some sort of ick that breaks out in fish if they're under a lot of stress. That sounded a little, no pun intended, but that sounded a little fishy to me. That's not really how ick works. And then when we got to talking about the cold water ick, I also began to think that maybe something else was going on, because that's not really the way ick functions. And so today we're going to talk about ick proper, the actual parasite known as ick. It is actually the parasite's name. I've been practicing this all day. Let's see if I can get it right. It's Ichthyophthirius multifiliis is the actual name of the parasite. Ichthyophthirius for short, but most people just say ick. It is typically spelled ICH, or sometimes it is spelled ICK. When it's abbreviated, it's usually spelled ICK. And that alone is ick. There are other things in the hobby that get referred to as ick, such as stress ick and marine ick, and there's something out there called black ick, and none of those are ick. Now, cold water ick was a new one to me, and I have not yet been able to find anything that specifically denotes a certain type of ick that lives in cold water, or a certain type of disease that mimics ick that cold water fish get. All I've been able to find is how to deal with ick in cold water environments. Cold water fish can still get ick, and it just has to be treated differently because of the differences in temperature. So we'll get into all that, and we're going to discuss all the differences between what all these are, and we're going to start with discussing ick proper, Ichthyophthirius, if you will, and we're going to talk about the life cycle of ick and why ick does not sort of lurk in your tank at all times. That's just this sort of undying myth. We're going to talk about that too. So, ick is very well understood. It's got a very basic life cycle, and it is a host-dependent parasite. In other words, it has to have a host available to it in order for it to continue living. So, the life cycle will start out with it in the fish. When you see that little white spot on the fish, that's because this little Ichthyophthirius, it's a protozoan parasite, and it burrows into the flesh of the fish, and it goes and actually eats the flesh of the fish. And that's where you see that little white spot. It's an irritation on the fish's body because there's a little injury right there. And so once the parasite has gotten its fill and it's ready to start reproducing, it then bores its way out of the fish and it falls to the bottom of the tank, or maybe it lands on a leaf or a rock or something, but it encapsulates itself in a cyst, and then it begins dividing, just simple cellular division, and it begins dividing and dividing and dividing, and eventually that cyst will become so full of new parasites that it will rupture open, and all of these new free swimming parasites will enter the water column. It could literally be thousands of them per cyst. So once they swim up into the water column, they have 48 hours to find a fish. If they don't find a fish within that 48 hours, they die. If they do find a fish within that 48 hours, they burrow back into its flesh and the cycle starts over. It's very basic, it's very simple. And so you can see why you go from having 1 or 2, 3 spots that you're just starting to notice on a fish, and then all of a sudden they're covered in white spots. You can see how one cycle of reproduction can go from having, you brought home a fish from the aquarium store, it had a few spots on it, and a week later, every fish in your tank is covered in white spots. All it takes is one, and it can produce thousands and thousands of these parasites in our aquarium. Now, out in the wild, fish will experience it probably throughout their lives, off and on, but in a huge, wide open environment like that, in a river, in a pond, when those free swimmers go out looking for new fish, the expanse of water they have to search for means that a few of them may find a fish, but most are probably going to die off, and no fish ever really gets covered in ick out in the wild. You put them in a box of water where they have nowhere to go, and you can see how just just a few iterations of a life cycle, it's an exponential explosion of these parasites in our tank. So it can get out of hand very quickly. But it's also very easy to treat. If you catch it in time, there's some simple medications you can use that just clear it right up, but you have to use the medications properly. The only time the ick is susceptible to the medication is during that free swimming period. So at roughly 75 to 78 degrees, which is what we would typically think of as a tropical aquarium, that whole entire life cycle happens in 10 days or less. And so that's why when you look at a package of ick medication, it says to increase the temperature. It usually says to increase it to 82 or 83 degrees. The idea is you want to speed that process up because that life cycle is completely temperature dependent. That's the only thing it's dependent on. It's not dependent on how much food it gets. It's not dependent on other water conditions, low oxygen, high pH. None of that has any impact. It's solely affected by the temperature. The warmer you make your tank, the faster that life cycle happens. And the idea is you want to rush them through, get them out of the fish, get them down into their cyst, get them back erupted out into the water column, and that's when they get killed off by the medication. And so you need to do it for a duration of about 10 days in order to make sure you've gotten all of them. Make sure all the cysts have erupted and all the free swimmers have gone out into the water, and the medication will kill them off. So in a cold water environment, it's very different. If you've got a tank that's 60 degrees or 65 degrees, that same process is going to happen, but it just slows way down. And that whole process can take 2 or 3 months to fully go through. So there's never a dormant cycle. There's never a period where the parasite goes to sleep or goes into hibernation or goes dormant in any way, waiting for the right conditions. I've been thinking about that all day too. I'm not even sure how the right conditions would be known about, with the idea of like fish being stressed and then suddenly there's an outbreak of ick on the fish when they get stressed. How would these dormant parasites know, oh, the fish are under stress, come on, let's go everybody, let's go get the fish? I don't even know what would trigger them to sort of suddenly start responding to the fish being under stress or their immune systems being weakened or whatever. I don't know. But anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. We'll talk about that in a minute. So in a cold water tank, all the same, everything I just said still applies. You still can only treat them when they're in their free swimming period. Now, I honestly don't know if they will live longer than 48 hours in their free swimming period if the water's colder. I never saw anything that said that. It's still basically, you got about a 48-hour window from the time they erupt and start looking for food, looking for a host, a fish. If they don't find it, within a couple of days, they die off. And so in a cold water system, you would literally have to treat that tank with medication continuously for however long it took for one full life cycle to go through. And then again, in a 60-degree tank or a 65-degree tank, that could be 2 months or 3 months where you're just continually having to medicate the tank, just waiting for them to eventually get to this free swimming stage of their life cycle. So everything I saw about how to treat ick in a cold water tank was to simply warm the tank to 75 degrees. The vast majority of cold water fish out there are not going to be bothered in the slightest bit by 75 degrees. If you've got some rare fish, like certain kinds of trout, they don't do well in temperatures above the 60s. Most cold water fish are fine in those warmer temperatures. Cold water fish usually defines a fish that's able to tolerate cold waters. It doesn't necessarily mean it has to be in cold water, like carp, goldfish, all those kind of fish. Even my sunfish and my minnows and stuff. The streams around here and the ponds and the lakes and stuff, they regularly get up into the upper 80s in the summertime, and those fish are just fine. But they also live just happily underneath the ice as well. That's a cold water fish. So if you've got goldfish, or you've got stream minnows, or if you've got white cloud mountain minnows or something like that, you can certainly raise your tank temperature to 75 degrees. Treat for 10 days, and then lower your temperature back down to whatever temperature you're keeping it at, and your fish will be fine. But that's the only really effective way you can treat ick in a cold water tank. You have to warm it up to treat it, because you have to speed that life cycle up. But the speed of that life cycle is wholly dependent on temperature and nothing else. It's not stress, it's not water conditions, or anything else. So the reason there's a lot of confusion, I think, out there about ick and how ick can suddenly spring up in your tank after months and months of so-called dormancy, again, this is just, there's no truth to that. Ick proper, the actual parasite, Ichthyophthirius, does not have a dormant stage. It does not linger and lurk in your tank waiting to erupt one day when the conditions are right or when the fish are sick or whatever. That simply does not happen. They either are actively feeding on the fish, and somewhere in that life cycle, and again, this will be happening very slowly in a colder tank, but in 75-degree tanks, that whole cycle happens in 7 to 10 days. And so your fish will always have white spots on them, and they'll get worse very quickly until all the fish are dead. And so just functionally, there's no possibility that you're going to go months and months without seeing any appearance of ick, and then suddenly there's going to be an outbreak. It simply does not work that way. It's not my opinion. It just doesn't work that way. There's a lot of things out there, though, that get called ick that aren't ick, and stress ick is one of those things. Stress ick, as far as I can tell, is a hormonal response that is basically, if you think about the way if a human gets stressed out a lot of times, some people will break out in hives. It's kind of like that. Stress ick will be a few white spots and white specks that might appear on the fish's skin. They don't exactly look like ick because they're not that sort of fuzzy, salty looking. It's just sort of white spots that develop. But for whatever reason, anytime there's any disease that causes spots to develop on a fish, we go right to the name ick. Black ick is another example. That is a parasite. It's a completely different parasite, and it's a bird parasite, but it lives in fish with the hopes that the fish will get eaten by birds, and then the parasite will get back into the bird's gut, and it causes little black spots to appear on the fish. It's more or less harmless to the fish, and it's more or less irrelevant to the aquarium hobby, but it gets called black ick. It's not even related to ick. It's not even the same kind of parasite. It's not even for the same species of animal. And yet it gets called ick. And the stress ick is the same way. When fish are under high stress conditions, just like with a human, I don't know what the actual stress hormones are in fish, but I know in humans it's cortisol. That's one of the main stress hormones anyway. When we think of stress hormones, it's usually cortisol that we're talking about. And a lot of cortisol for long periods of times is just not good for your health, and it can cause all kind of weird stuff to happen. And in fish, when they're under high stress for long periods of time, you will sometimes see these outbreaks of white spots that appear on them, and that gets called stress ick. It's not ick, doesn't have anything to do with ick. It's not a parasite, doesn't have anything to do with something erupting out of your soil or anything like that. It's just a physiological reaction your fish's body is having to excessive hormones, excessive stress hormones and stressful conditions. It could be poor diet. Again, it could be all these conditions that people always talk about that bring on this supposed ick that's been laying dormant. So that could be a confusing aspect of it. People confuse stress ick for actual ick. Again, with the cold water ick, I don't know if I'm missing something somewhere. Is there a disease that only affects cold water fish or something like that? I don't know, but I couldn't find anything about a cold water ick. All I could find was ick and how to deal with it in cold water environments. And again, you have to sort of treat it differently. Very long periods of time with medication, or you have to warm the temperature up to speed the life cycle up. So there's nothing out there anywhere that suggests, because of the way this animal's life cycle is, that there would be a dormant period. And yet that myth persists so strongly that on one of the websites I was reading, getting some information today, I couldn't believe what I was reading. First of all, I was very happy with what I was reading. It was very accurate information. It talked all about the life cycle of the ick and how quickly it goes and how this is why we treat it with warmer temperatures. Talked about cold water temperatures, Everything was spot on, and it even went so far as to say, if you have a larger tank that has an outbreak of ick, you know, if you've introduced ick into the tank and you want to collect the fish out of the tank and put them in a smaller tank to treat them for a couple of weeks, there's no need to treat this tank, because without fish being in the tank, after 10 days, the ick would simply die off. If there's no host in there, it dies off. It is a host-dependent parasite. So if there's no fish in the tank, they're all getting treated in a hospital tank somewhere else. The ick has nothing to feed on, and after that first life cycle goes through, it's done. You can safely put the fish back in the tank without fear of them catching ick again, because it's all gone, provided the tank temperature is at least 75 degrees or warmer. So this article explained that very clearly and very accurately. And then in the same article at the bottom of it, it talked about how ick always lives in our aquarium, and if your fish get too stressed out or the conditions are right, you'll have an eruption of ick, and you'll have ick just get on your fish and all. Like, you just explained that it can't happen that way. You just explained how if the ick is not actively feeding on a fish, it dies off. And in the same article, it just regurgitates this same, I mean, it's almost word for word. I've heard that so many times over the years, that when the conditions are right or the fish are under stress, you'll have this eruption of ick. And you don't. That is not how it works. You may have things happen to your fish that cause white spots to be on them. There's another disease out there that's not really attacking the fish, but it gets on the fish. It's called Epistolis or possibly Epistylis. I've talked about this a lot. It looks very, very much like ick. It looks more like ick than all these other things that get called ick looks. And yet it's not ick, and it's something completely different. And that will get on your fish when the conditions are right, if the tank's a little poorly kept or there's too much organics and bacteria and so on and so forth. And so that gets confused for ick a lot of times. I myself learned it the hard way because I confused it for ick. Now, I brought it home from the aquarium shop that way. They already had the white spots on them, so I wasn't baffled by this sort of sudden outbreak out of nowhere. I brought those fish home with it, but what I was dealing with that I thought was ick was not. And so there's a lot of confusion out there about ick, and most of it comes from the fact that so many things get called ick and they're not. The actual parasite Ichthyophthirius has a very well understood life cycle. It's a very definitive thing. There's no mystery aspect to it. There's no, I've heard people say, well, science doesn't know everything. You never know. Someday we might find out that no, it doesn't. That's like telling me dogs can hibernate through the winter. If they eat enough in the fall, they can sleep for 4 months and then wake up in the spring. They cannot do that. I don't care if you've heard people say that. I don't care if you're going to tell me a story about a sleepy dog you knew when you were a kid that seemed to just sleep all winter. Like, that doesn't change anything. Dogs are not physically capable of hibernation. And this parasite is not physically capable of a dormant stage. There is none. It's either actively working through the fish, in which you're going to know about it, or it's not in your tank. If you got white spots that have just appeared from somewhere, the fish are stressed, or you've been kind of lax on your maintenance lately and you're getting some white spots appearing on the fish, I'm not going to argue with that. That can certainly happen. But it's not ick. It's not the actual parasite ick. And if you're treating it for ick, you're probably not going to have much success with it, because it's not ick. Ick does not always live in our tanks and then suddenly come out when there's, the conditions are right. Again, I don't even know how that would work. But cold water ick, don't know if that's an actual thing other than what we've already discussed, just dealing with ick in cold water temperatures. Again, you raise the temperatures, then you deal with the ick, and then you lower your temperatures back down. Stress ick is not ick. It's just white spots that develop on a fish because of hormonal responses to chronic stress conditions. Marine ick is a condition that's something that grows on marine fish that's not ick at all. It's some other sort of parasite that lives in salt water. And then black ick, as we discussed, is a bird parasite that has no relation whatsoever to the Ichthyophthirius parasite that we know and love here in the aquarium hobby. And then, of course, you've got that Ichthyophthirius, which most people have never even heard of, that looks exactly like ick, that does get on your fish when they're stressed and the conditions are poor and so on and so forth. And yet that doesn't even get called ick, and most people have never even heard of it. And that's probably more often than not the culprit of when people say, yeah, I got this bad case of ick and I just, nothing cleared it up and all my fish eventually died. They probably didn't die from ick. They probably died from this Ichthyophthirius, again, not sure how that's pronounced. But that's about all I can tell you for the ick. You know, I said I would look up the cold water ick. I said I would look up stress water ick and shoot a video talking about my findings, and those were my findings, is pretty much as I suspected. You know, ick has a very well understood lifestyle. There's this idea that it just lives in our tank all the time. It's just a myth that just will not die, but there's no truth to it. It does not live in our tanks all the time, doesn't wait for the right conditions to spring, etc. So there you go. You can rush to the comment section, although you've probably already been down there telling me why I'm wrong and so on and so forth by now. I get a lot of that when I shoot these videos, but I'm going to keep on shooting them as long as I keep getting told that ick certainly does have a dormant stage in there. It doesn't. It does not. So I'll keep shooting them. You keep commenting on them. Thanks for watching. Make sure you subscribe. Don't forget, I do a live stream every Friday night at 8 p.m. and I do a live stream every Sunday night as a topic discussion at 7 p.m. Eastern time. So we do that at a new time now on Sundays at 7 p.m. So make sure you subscribe, make sure you ring that bell. I'll see you real soon in the next one.